Okay, we're back. The second half of the kind of talk about how English politics impacts colonization focuses starting with Charles I and this idea of personal rule going forward, and why his personal rule ends in 1640, and what happens to him, and the long-term results of this rise of conflict between the King in England and the English Parliament, and how the long-term results also impact colonization. So we're going to get a civil war between the King and much of the rest of the country. It's very complex. It eventually becomes about a 5-way civil war where there's 5 different factions all fighting against each other all at the same time in the last years of the war. But it's extraordinarily complex, and we're going to skip past a whole lot of the details and try to keep it simple between King and Parliament. But that's where we're going, and the idea of restoration as we go forward. All right, so here's a simple map of England and Scotland. England is in the south, Scotland's in the north. The King, Charles I, didn't just lose control over England. He lost control over Scotland actually first in the 1630s. He tried to change which version of the Bible that the Scots were using in their own religious services, and that started riots in some instances in Scotland itself. So Scotland actually goes into rebellion against King Charles first. And he loses control over Scotland to the point where even the Scottish kind of militia revolutionary army against the King even invade England and start conquering areas of northern England. And that's a humiliation for the King, because now he can't, not only has he lost control over Scotland, but the rebellious Scots are now invading northern England, and there's a real threat of the Scottish army conquering big parts of England and just, taking it. So the English King uses that excuse to build up a large army, or at least to ask for the permission to build up a large army. Parliament, again, even though it's not officially meeting, still refuses. The King is in a real bind. He can't really raise much tax revenue without permission from Parliament. So a standoff hits. Parliament enjoys the fact that the Scottish army has invaded, because that forces the King to compromise, they hope, with the English Parliament. Does that make sense? He needs a big army to repel the invasion, so he needs higher taxes, so he is going to pretty much go hat in hand to Parliament and ask for higher tax rates. So Parliament thinks that the Scottish invasion is going to push the King to do what they want. Not especially. He's going to just try to do it himself, which outrages Parliament, and a war breaks out. And to put the war, a very complex war, very simply, Parliament was in power around the city of London, which is in the southeast of the country. London had the biggest populations, the biggest tax base. The cities around London tended to support Parliament. The King had more support amongst the big landowners, which were to the north and west of the country. So you see the first map up in the north, the top left corner. The King is in power mostly in the north and the west. He calls his nobles to him to defend him in this war. So he has a military advantage because the nobles have all the experience in actually fighting. The masses of the workers don't really have much military training. So Parliament can build a gigantic army over time, but they're not very well trained or well supplied. So the war goes on, they attack each other. Eventually, Parliament starts winning the big battles by the end. They very nearly capture the King by about mid-1645. The war breaks out somewhere in late 41, so that's about 4 years later. We're skipping past huge amounts of detail here. In order to escape being captured, he rides north to try to go to Scotland, which is ironic. He thinks that the Scottish people will be more lenient to him than the English Parliament if he is captured. Didn't work out well for him, because he rides north to Scotland, the Scottish army captures him, and then they sell him to Parliament. They ransom him for just a money payment. So he is sent back to London to answer for what Parliament considers crimes. He has raised an army against his own people. There are negotiations going on between the king and the leaders of parliament. Basically, they don't want to get rid of him. They just wanted to teach him a lesson. You can't have that much power to yourself all the time. You have to, compromise with us. So most of parliament, most of the country most of the English people did not want to get rid of their king. They liked having a king. A lot of them still liked him as king. And he tried to use that to his advantage to negotiate to get back to his throne. He is basically under house arrest in one of his castles while these negotiations are going on. And he, right to the end, believes that they're going to put him back on the throne, just have some restricted power, some limits. This is where some more radical leaders in Parliament start taking control. And they demand that he be put on trial. And he is. Does anyone want to take a guess at what the official charge against the king is? Treason against his own people. Which is an interesting theory. Does anybody want to take a guess at what the king's legal defense in this trial is? He only gives one major statement on one day of the trial. No guesses? No takers?
God told him to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He says, "Who the hell are you to put me on trial? God chose me to be your leader. This is a slap in the face to God to put me in jail and put me on trial for treason against my own country. That doesn't make any sense. I am the monarch of England. I have the divine right of the kingship to lead this country in any way I see fit. You have no authority." And he said at his trial, "I appeal to the highest authority in the universe. God is the one who will defend me in this." It's an interesting theory. Unfortunately for the king, who do you think the jury is in this trial? Parliament. And they don't listen much to the king's argument. So the trial goes on for, I think it's something like 2 days. Guilty. It's a foregone conclusion. They take a vote. He's guilty. Next question is, what do you do with a king who is guilty of treason against his own people? Do you put him back on the throne? Who knows? A lot of people argue against it. A lot of people argue for it. If you're not going to put him back on the throne, another question arises. What do you do with him? Do you kick him out of the country? Do you put him in jail for the rest of his life? What are the problems with those moves? The king has supporters. Loyal supporters who will fight to the death to get him back on the throne. So as long as that king is around somewhere, there is a possibility of a revolution against the government. Right? So what's the number one guaranteed way to make sure that the king's supporters don't come back and try to do something? You kill him. And that's what they did. They took him out into one of the big public squares in London, January 30th of 49. And he is executed by beheading with an axe. And this is a big leap forward for any European society. This is almost unheard of. The European people don't usually do this stuff. They don't even take the step of putting their king on trial, much less go this far and execute him. And the rumor is, and historians have some a leg to stand on, according to the diaries and letters that were written about this event. A lot of people watch this because this is a once-in-a-lifetime type deal, and you're not going to see this often. And reportedly, when the axe fell and the king was executed, the crowd just went, eesh. They don't appear to have been very supportive of this move, and they seem to have regretted it immediately. But the king is executed, so Parliament is really in control of the country. They're the only kind of legitimate government body. So they start passing laws about what kind of government they're going to create now that they've gotten rid of the monarchy. And number one, they say that there are no more kings, so the kingship is abolished. A couple months later, a couple days later, they abolished the House of Lords, which is the higher body of Parliament, where only landowners sit and they inherit their title as a lord just by being a big landowner. There's other dukes and the barons and whatnot. So the House of Commons, which is where the common people are elected to go be representatives, vote the House of Lords out of existence, and they say that England is no longer a monarchy or a kingdom, because that implies having a king. They call themselves at this point a commonwealth, which brings a whole big bag of new questions. What does commonwealth mean? How does this represent what the government's going to do? They literally took this word commonwealth to mean England is like a community of equal peoples that worked for the common well-being of society. And that the deal is that the adult males will be able to vote for their political leaders. They'll have fairly consistent elections. And the winners of those elections will go to Parliament and they will run the country. So there are a lot of ideas about equality and democracy and representative politics. And this is a radical idea. This is way off the boards, far leftist theory. This is unheard of in Europe for a long, long, long time. I mean, this idea of democracy hasn't come about really since the fall of Rome, over 1,000 years before. So this is a big step in a very radical leftist direction. Who were the conservatives of the time, do you think? Political conservatives. Well, Catholics to a large extent, but not because they're Catholic. What do they support that makes them conservative? What do they want? They want the monarchy. They're monarchists. Have we talked in here about the difference between political conservatism and liberalism? Okay. In general, if you take the word conservative in politics, it generally means keep things the way they are. Don't change things, right? The system is running well. If we mess with it too much, we can cause all kinds of problems. So generally, conservatives want to keep things the way they are. Liberals want to change things, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So according to that definition, the people who do this Commonwealth thing, they are the kind of far leftist liberals. They are going in for radical change of government and society in a lot of ways. And the conservatives, or political conservatives, are usually the people who wanted the kingship, wanted monarchy, wanted stability. Okay, so questions about any of this so far?
Can you explain the Commonwealth again?
Commonwealth is an idea where there's not one class that really controls everything. The people are more equal, and therefore they kind of work for each other's assistance. It's literally the kind of community type of idea. We're all in this together kind of thing. Another question somewhere I saw. Yeah?
Was how many people usually formed a parliament group? Was it head of parliament or anything?
There are some major leaders of parliament who give the big speeches and whatnot, but nothing yet like a prime minister as we know it today. The numbers I would have to look up, but it's over 50. I mean, it's a fairly large group. They don't meet in any kind of real gigantic hall. It's a room maybe as big as this room or twice as big as this room. It's not like some gigantic building or anything. But I'd have to look up exactly at this point in 4950 how many people are in Parliament. I believe it was under 200, but it's more than just like 10 or 20. So it's somewhere in that middle. I'd have to look up the exact stat. Other questions? Okay. They drew up a series of different documents proposing different things, how to build the government. The one that really took and that the English people seem to have agreed with was creatively called the Second Agreement with the People, which enshrined a lot of this equality and democracy and voting rights and representative politics. So after they abolished the kingship, they seemed to be by default going in the direction of this Second Agreement. The major problem is that the real bigwig kind of leader who pushed for the execution of the king and all these other kind of real radical steps, violent steps, he was a leader in the Parliament's army during the war, so he is famous as a general. His name is Cromwell, and he really starts to control Parliament. He is so popular amongst the members in Parliament for leading them in this direction that they start following him into some other policies that are not really representative of equality or democracy really in any way. And he uses his power in Parliament to, over time, keep control of the army and start to push Parliament around. So he really starts to set himself up as the new dictator. And he starts wielding power much like the king had during the personal rule. And he eventually dissolves Parliament completely. He gets Parliament to do some things that he wants, and then he starts calling them a corrupt leadership that can't be trusted, and so he sends them home also. And basically Cromwell will rule England through the rest of his life in the late 50s by a personal rule kind of system. So he is basically a king. He doesn't want to call himself king because he led the movement to get rid of the kingship. So he gets a title, he gets Parliament to name him, quote, Lord High Protector of the Realm. Which sounds like king, just without the word king. He appoints his eldest son to be heir to his power, and he starts doing all the things that the old monarchy had done, basically, in consolidating power around his own position. In the 1650s, he launches wars, foreign wars, wars of invasion against parts of Scotland, particularly against Ireland. This is where the English go in and try to colonize Ireland and wipe out the Irish, knock out their big landowners, take all the land for themselves, and bring English people in to be the feudal lords of Ireland. And this is the beginning of the long-term hatred between the English and the Irish, where they assassinate each other and do all kinds of horrible things politically in a fight over Ireland. And the Irish say, we were victimized first by the English invasion, which was a horrible, brutal, bloody invasion. One of probably the worst in Europe in this period. It was just absolutely merciless. And so the Irish say that they, in order to resist and keep control of their country, they're entitled to, take the violence to the invaders. So that starts off the kind of revolutionary Irish movement and, long-term levels of violence that went on until the late 1900s. So that's one war that Cromwell leads. He also builds up the English Navy and starts launching attacks against several, especially Caribbean islands that he thought were valuable, and starts trying to get England to grow in the colonies, get more colonial power. So these are other steps at launching foreign invasions to grow the power of the English government under his own position, of course. And he becomes famous for those also. To take a look at the map pretty quickly, a lot of the Caribbean islands had been conquered by Spain. When Columbus first went over and the Spanish went in and conquered as much land as they could hold. The problem by the mid-1600s is that Spain's economy has fallen apart. Its military power has collapsed, basically. So Spain is on the kind of decline in the 1600s, and everybody knows it. So countries like France, England, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, they start launching invasions against Spanish-held islands, and that are pretty successful over time. And these Caribbean islands are astronomically profitable. They have a staple crop themselves that is hugely more profitable even than tobacco. Does anyone know what that is? Sugar. It's a tropical climate, and they rip apart the forest of a lot of these islands and replace the forest with sugar fields. Of course, bring in African slaves to work all this stuff. And the profits of just these tiny, even the smallest little islands out here in the ocean are just, they're far beyond anything that even all of the Chesapeake Bay colonies can produce, as you can see by this chart here. This is the value of different regions of the English Empire at this point, different places that England had colonized. So you see the middle colonies, these are still Dutch at this point. New England, its profitability is down here at the bottom. Is that the Chesapeake up there at the top? So tobacco. And if you just look at the price of the export price of sugar, the total value just dwarfs all these other colonies. And investors and military leaders go where the money is. And I think it's in the mid-1700s when France gains control over this island that was at that point called Hispaniola. Eventually it gets split in half between Haiti and I think the Dominican Republic. When France conquers that island, France proposes to trade that one island to, I think it's England, for all the English colonies of North America. Just a straight up trade. That huge amount of territory up in the continent for that little island. That's the difference in how profitable these lands are. So that's why they are attacked. And that's why they're colonized. And that's why they evolved probably the most brutal form of African slavery in the whole New World, which only engenders revolutionary movements amongst the slaves against the European ownership class, which is what Haiti became. Haiti was the first slave revolt to actually succeed and create their own country, independent country. So questions about any of that? Nope. Cromwell dies in, you don't have to write all the details of this chart down, but Cromwell dies in 1658, I believe, when he went to Ireland on one of his visits to see how the invasion's going. He contracted malaria and died. His son Richard immediately ascends to be the next Lord High Protector of the realm. But a lot of English people didn't like Cromwell by that point. He was a pretty merciless dictator, didn't put up with any kind of complaint or anything like that. So largely the English people and English political leaders realized that this is their opportunity to get rid of Cromwell's government. They view his son as weaker, not willing to, say, massacre people to stay in control. They see this as their great opportunity, so they rise up against the son quickly and kick him out. So Parliament is in control of the country again. Parliament doesn't really want to control the country again. They believe that, again, they need a king to be the linchpin of society. And if they're going to go back and have a king again, they might as well bring back the old monarchy in their view. So they make contact with the dead king who they had beheaded, his children, the royal family that are now in exile. They're living in France. So they contact his eldest son, named Charles also, and they make him an offer. Why don't you come back to England, we'll make you king again. Sorry about cutting your father's head off. And they do. They make the offer, and he says, okay, if I'm going to return, I'm going to get certain things that I want, mostly the guarantee that you're never going to chop my head off. He goes back, and this is where the so-called restoration begins. The restoration of the monarchy. And this is Charles II on his throne. And he'll be around for about 25 years. So you see all the absolutism, all the imagery of the power and aura of the king's body himself. I mean, even his feet get a pillow. So there's Charles II. And Charles II had a pretty easy rule, because very few English people wanted to go back to the so-called Commonwealth, or the idea of republicanism, which is the idea that you get rid of the king and then all the kind of political leaders are under the same law as everybody else. You know, political leaders can't break the law, or they can be punished by fines or jail time or whatever, just like anybody else in society. That's what republicanism basically means. And that idea is humiliated. The English people look around and say, well, we tried that about 10, 12 years ago. It didn't turn out very well for us. Maybe a good idea on paper, but when you try to put it into effect, someone's going to take control. So they bring back the king. The idea of republicanism is the butt of many jokes in England for the next few decades. They continue with Parliament, though. The Parliament continues to sit. They hold new elections. A new group of leaders of Parliament go into office, And they systematically give the new king whatever he wants, and in fact give him more than he ever asked for, and give him more than his father, the guy whose head they cut off, had ever asked for. They give Charles II a lifetime sales tax, which means he has high tax revenue that he can do whatever he wants with. They give him a larger army than he ever asked for, and larger than his father ever asked for. So they're literally giving him whatever he wants. He doesn't even have to ask. And for that reason, historians call this the Cavalier Parliament. They just bend over backwards to make this guy happy. The one major thing they kept from this kind of middle area after they got rid of monarchy, they had passed laws that destroyed feudalism in England itself for all intents and purposes. They destroyed the relationship between the peasants and the landowners. You know how the peasants were tied to the land. You inherited your father's position as the kind of serf farmer on that area. They broke that apart and really made England into a kind of open labor market for farmers. If you think that you can get a better deal from the landowner in the next valley over, you can pick up and move there if you sign a contract with him. That's going to be your wage. They become wage workers, basically, not tied to the land. And because so many of them are desperate for jobs, they start agreeing to lower and lower wages. Supply and demand kicks in. And the landowners love it. And that's probably why Parliament chose to keep the end of feudalism, because if you keep the same amount of revenue, but you're paying your workers far less, your profit goes up. And the landowners see their profit go up with the end of feudalism inside England. So you have an open labor market inside England, but not outside England in the empire, all the places they colonized. India, North America, some of the Caribbean islands, some of the islands off Southeast Asia. Those are run by foreign monopolies. Companies get monopolistic powers. One company gets to sell all tea in India or North America. One company gets to sell all paper. And in that way, they're guaranteeing, again, astronomical profits to the leaders of those companies in the foreign markets. So the short story of this is the rich get vastly richer and the poor, comparatively, get vastly poorer in England. And Charles II continues building up the English Navy. Eventually, I think it's him who becomes known as the father of the modern English Navy. And he does this to launch continued wars over colonies overseas, to increase the size of the English Empire. And specifically targeting the Dutch at this point. Because the Dutch also have a large empire. They don't have nearly as large of a navy, though, so they can't cover all their colonies at the same time. So they become kind of like easy pickings for the English to attack. Questions about this at all? What the restoration is, or what its kind of longer-term meaning, importance is? Nope. Okay. Moving on. Also, when Charles gets to the throne again, 1660, he quickly starts giving out land, again, just like most feudal lords did, to his followers. The people who were loyal to him in England in the 1650s when he and his family were in exile in France. When Cromwell was in office, running things. There were a lot of English people who still openly declared that they wanted the old monarchy back. And when Charles II gets back to the throne, he rewards those supporters. And one of the biggest ways, of course, in rewarding someone with money is to give them a bunch of land. And he carves out a giant piece of land just south of the Virginia colony, just south of Jamestown, and parcels it out to his political supporters from the 50s, the bad times for the monarchy. And so landowners get a huge tracts, thousands of acres in some instances of land, and they go in and they start trying to, at first they grow tobacco. It doesn't grow as easily, just because especially along the seaboard, along the coastline, the land is much closer to the water and it floods much more consistently. You get more hurricanes and whatnot. So their staple crop will become rice. And rice needs the land to be inundated, but also is very labor heavy, so the so-called Carolina colony comes into existence and starts massively importing African slaves right off its bat, right from its start. Eventually, to the point by the early to mid-1700s, there are twice as many slaves in the Carolina colonies than there are owners, white landowners. And that will have, obviously, long-term social problems going into the future that still largely affect a lot of its politics today in those areas. So that's the creation of Carolina. There's another tract of land that the king gives out to a religious group that felt that they were kind of socially ostracized again in England, called the Society of Friends, that are derisively called Quakers to make fun of them because they felt they had God spirit in them, so they, at their meetings sometimes they kind of shook. And William Penn is the big leader of this religious group in England, so they're given a big tract of land to basically go and be free of persecution. Penn was also a supporter of the king. So the new colony that eventually emerges becomes known as Pennsylvania, basically Penn's land. Penn is a little bit different from a lot of the other colonists. He actually goes and tries to have good relations with the natives of the land that he is given. You know, the natives didn't have any say in this. They were living on their land one day, and then this English guy shows up and says, "Hey, my king gave me all your land." You know, usually it doesn't go over very well, and that's where natives tend to fight back. So Penn personally and sent his government leaders in advance to form good relations with natives of their area and say, "We are not going to persecute you, we're not going to enslave you, you can join our colony if you want." And he even bought land from them. He gave them money for the land that they were taking. So right off the bat, Pennsylvania colony will have much better relation with its indigenous peoples than a whole lot of the other English colonies and French colonies and Dutch colonies going into the future. So a lot of those lands were just outright conquered. So again, pretty optimistic painting of William Penn and his friendship with these people. And he did this largely for religious reasons. The Society of Friends has a very kind of egalitarian view of human society, that everybody is kind of born equal and no one should be persecuted or damaged just because of their religious beliefs. So he really put that into effect. But he's one of the few colonists who did that. So questions about that? Creation of Pennsylvania? Nope. All right. A major problem for Pennsylvania, which is kind of down here where the Delaware River is that that's starting to bump up against Dutch colonies that they call the New Netherlands and their capital city colony, New Amsterdam. The New English colonists get into some arguments about who actually owns certain territories. And this becomes such a problem that eventually the king decides to do something about this. And the king of England will eventually argue that through some legal means that the king of England actually owns all that land that the Dutch happen to be living on. Questionable, but it appears that the king makes this argument and then promises to somehow get a hold of the land and give it to his younger brother, the Prince of York. And he's known as Prince James. He's officially the next in line for the throne. Charles doesn't have any official heirs, any official children, because most of his children are with mistresses and stuff like that. So there is no son of Charles that will be the next king. So it goes to his younger brother. And in order to get a lot of political support in England for the younger brother, you give the younger brother a bunch of land and then he can parcel it out to his friends, right? To build up support amongst the rich. To ensure that this happens, the King of England launches an invasion. Sends the English Navy to New Amsterdam. The Dutch Navy wasn't around, so the city is pretty much undefended. And the English Navy shows up one morning and says, we have a bunch of boats out here with cannons on them, so either you can agree to just surrender without a shot being fired, and this will become an English colony. You can keep your businesses and a lot of your property, and you just have to admit that you're going to be run by the English throne now. Or you can fight back and probably be destroyed. So the city leaders say, we're not going to win this either way, so we might as well just not be destroyed. So the English invasion of New Amsterdam is largely non-violent. It's just through threat, and the city gives in. So the city is conquered, and the colony is renamed New York, and this becomes New York City. What we today refer to as Manhattan Island. That was the original New Amsterdam. And that will be New York City until the late 1800s, so beyond the end of our semester. New York City is only Manhattan Island until something like 1893, when it brings Brooklyn and the area called Queens. They all become parts of an enlarged New York City in the late 1800s. But that's how New York gets its name. The Prince of York took over, named it after himself, and started giving out land to his own supporters in England. And another piece is kind of broken off to the side, where another group, political group, comes in, and that becomes known as New Jersey. So those are the creation of those colonies. So question about how that's accomplished at all. Nope. You guys are awake. Sound like you're breathing. It's about the only way I can tell. And so this is what the long-term map of English colonization eventually creates by about the 1670s, a line of English-dominated colonies. Oftentimes very different from each other, and especially in terms of how much slavery and how much disease and what their economies are built to do over time. But they will start growing, especially in the 1700s. Their population starts skyrocketing, and their colonies start to expand from the coastline. There's a Appalachian mountain range that really divides, is kind of the theoretical boundary of how far these colonies stretch westward. And on the other side of the mountains, there's just kind of open territory. There's a lot of native tribes out there. There's a lot of French colonists and Dutch and all kinds of people. So that's what this looks like going into the early 1700s. Going a little bit further than that to keep going with the theme of English politics. Again, you don't have to write down this whole chart. But Charles is around until 1685. He dies. Doesn't have any official children, so his younger brother, James, gets to the throne and becomes known as James II. The easy way to remember this is the lineup goes James, Charles, Charles, James. Right? So they are the kings of England in the 1600s. With Cromwell in the middle. Right in the middle, in the 50s. Okay. Charles II was known to be Catholic in his kind of heart and his desire. But he couldn't say so publicly because there's a real fear that the Protestants will rise up and get rid of him and find a Protestant to be king. So Charles is officially Protestant until his deathbed. He converts to Catholicism as he is dying. James is a very different person. He is openly Catholic. He says he will never convert to Protestantism. So there's a lot of fears about James becoming the next king amongst the Protestants. Will he bring back the kind of Catholic persecution of Protestants like under Queen Mary in the mid-1500s where Protestants were burned at the stake and all kinds of ugly stuff? They had a lot of confidence in James II because he's already fairly middle-aged. He's getting up there in years. And also because of, let's see, you don't have to write all that down just yet. Because of this, and again, you don't have to write this chart down. James' personal life is complicated. He was married. He had 2 children, but they are both daughters. The eldest daughter is married herself eventually by 1670s, 1680s. She is married to a type of military leader in the Dutch Republic who is openly Protestant. So when James is first named heir to the English throne, the Protestants figure, okay, James will be around for a while. His wife has already died. His new wife looks like she's not going to have any children. She appears to be barren. So James is going to be around for a while. He's probably going to die fairly soon. He's getting up there in years. His daughter will inherit his throne. And if his daughter does, that means that really the Protestant Dutch guy will. He'll be probably the next king of England. And therefore the Protestants will have their king. Right? Does that make sense? Problem is that very quickly after he becomes king, in his mind a miracle occurs. His second wife gets pregnant, gives birth to a boy. So all this plan is wiped out because now you've got male inheritors of the throne, right? And this is where James makes probably his series of really dumb mistakes. Number one, right when he gets to the throne, he says Catholics will be allowed to hold government office, which made the Protestants in England suspicious. Next, he passes a law called the Declaration of Indulgence, says that trying to force Catholics in England to convert to Protestantism has failed, so we're going to have full toleration of Catholicism in England, which again makes the Protestants more suspicious. Then his son is born, and he says openly the son will be raised as a staunch Catholic. His wife is an Italian princess who has close ties to the Pope. And now the Protestants are very afraid, because they see nothing but a future of Catholic kings for their country going in, could go on for centuries. Who knows? And they start taking moves to get these Catholics off the throne. And they even started doing it on the day that the boy was born. The baby was born that day. They start obviously taking steps to try to get rid of the Catholic throne. How do they do this? The birth of the heir to the throne, the royal birth, is a public event. Literally, the leaders of Parliament and the nobles would gather in the room where the birth is taking place. The queens did not have privacy, because the nobles said they had to guarantee that that actual baby was the one that popped out. But the Protestant leaders go to this event when the baby's being born, and they literally turn the other way, and they look at the wall. And we have famous paintings of them literally covering their eyes like this, don't want to see. And they say that they are giving the queen privacy. But very quickly they start spreading rumors that when the baby was born, the baby was switched and a different infant was brought in and placed in the kind of crib. Therefore, the Protestants can and will argue that this baby is not the actual king or the actual heir to the throne. So it's all a political trick. And it's ridiculous. This had never happened before, but they're looking for an excuse to argue against this inheritance, right? Does that make sense? And they're going to extremes. I mean, this is ridiculed. Now, I use that term very specifically. Ridiculous means deserving of ridicule, and this was ridiculous. This was not normal. So they start making arguments that this baby boy is not the actual heir to the throne, that the actual heir is secretly being kept away or something like that. So there's a whole lot of conspiracy and worry and rumors and all kinds of weird stuff going on. And they actively start looking for a way to knock James II off his own throne. And they hit upon the idea, well, the Dutch Republic, as it exists at this point, Holland, the government of Holland, has a pretty powerful navy. One of the most powerful in the world even at this point, but the English navy is bigger. So the Protestant leaders in Parliament secretly start opening negotiations with this guy sitting in Holland saying, why don't you raise an army, invade England, and we will keep the back door open for you. why don't you come in and knock out our king, and we can make you king. It could be a win-win for everybody. So a conspiracy is formed and actually hits in 1688-89. Going into 1689, the invasion does leave Holland, which is kind of way up here, up in northern Europe. And they cross the English Channel. They go to London. And now King James has a decision to make. Is he going to fight it out? Tough. He feels like he's outgunned and outnumbered, and like all of Protestant England is against him. And he appears to have some kind of mental breakdown for a couple of days. He and his family quickly flee. They go to France. And so England is basically conquered by a foreign invasion without much fighting, without much bloodshed. And the English in their history call this the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because it's mostly nonviolent and because it got rid of the Catholic throne and brought in a Protestant leadership again. So you get the so-called kind of dual kingship. They become known as the Protestant kings. Queen Mary is the English link. She is the daughter of the deposed king. So she will rule as like a co-sovereign, a kind of co-ruler with her husband, who becomes known as William III. Yeah.
Okay, so Queen Mary is this King James's daughter, correct?
Yep.
So was there like bad blood between her and her dad because
this is
of this?
power politics.
So
This is that would be like saying, why is there bad blood between Obama and Romney? They're running for the same office.
Okay,
This is real power decision making.
even though so her dad didn't hold it against her for what went down. He
Well,
just knew it was politics.
No, he held it against her.
I'm like, you would,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
And
how can you not?
he held it against her for converting to Protestantism in the first place.
Oh.
So there's already that conflict, and she was already married and living outside the house, so he didn't have any control over it really anymore.
Right.
She was in a foreign government.
Okay.
But yeah, King James doesn't forget. And if you go back to the chart, his son doesn't forget. And when Mary dies just a few years later, and so William III actually runs England himself as what is basically a foreign king. And he dies in 1702, and then it goes to the younger daughter, Anne.
Okay.
And every time one of these monarchs dies, you've got James II's son, and then his inheritors, his sons and his grandsons, and on down through the centuries. Every time one of the English monarchs dies, they say, "Hey, wait, what about us?
Yeah.
We're supposed to be on the throne." And the English derisively, as an insult, call them the pretenders to the throne. So there's always that question. The pretenders live in France down through the centuries, and there's always this question when one of the English monarchs dies, are the French going to support an invasion to put what should have been the actual royal family back on the throne? It doesn't happen in the long term, but there's always that fear. And that they'll form an alliance with the Scottish or the Irish to attack in the back and basically stab England in the back. And the English government has that paranoid fear for many, 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 many years, right down into the 1900s. Okay, so that's them. I guess I could have just gone forward. Okay. Let's see. So Mary II dies. William III is in control of the country. And then when he dies and they don't have any children, now you got a big problem. So it goes down to Anne I. She's only around for about a dozen years, and then she dies without children. So now you got another problem. How do the English people guarantee that they're going to get another Protestant on their throne because the pretenders are still around asking, or demanding really, we should be kings. What about us? So at this step in 1714, the English Parliament takes a pretty radical move. They import, if I can go back to the map, a German king who speaks no English, has largely never been to England before, but he's Protestant, and he agrees to basically let Parliament run the country. So they bring him from this, if you can see up here, kind of beigeish color up here, Hanover. He is I think it's the Duke of Hanover, one of these small northern German governments. They import him and make him King of England. So you get the so-called House of Hanover taking over the English monarchy. And they'll be in control through the early 1800s. George III, eventually, I think he lives until something like 1820 or somewhere around there. But George I is German. Speaks German. It's German culture, everything. So when he is brought in, really, Parliament is the one running the deal. And this is where you get the new position really rising called the Prime Minister. The political party who gets the majority in Parliament, they're in power. They can just vote to pass laws. And they basically take over the administration, the executive function of government also. So the Prime Minister, right down to today, is usually the majority in Parliament, and therefore they are made the heads of the military. Members of their party are made heads of the military, heads of the finance, the budget, head of the hospital systems, head of the major administrative posts. And the major leader of that party becomes known as the Prime Minister, the big decision maker, the one who sets the agenda. And George I lasts until 27. His eldest son becomes George II. He lasts a couple decades, then George III comes in. But behind the scenes, the major parties in Parliament are really controlling the show. And the first really powerful one is Robert Walpole, and he's in office for a couple decades. And this is where you see the English government, even Parliament, becoming corrupt. Because who wins elections then and today? The candidates who spend the most money. Even in the United States today. The candidate, the campaign that outspends its enemy wins 90% of your elections. And if you get into office, you can give away favors, you can give away land, you can lower tax rates on your supporters. Therefore, they're hard to knock out. Because if you give more money to your supporters, that means you get more money in donations, which means you win the next election, right? And that cycle goes on and on. So the early prime ministers tend to stay around for a couple decades. And they're very difficult to knock out. But another thing you notice with the imagery, the kings, for their official royal portrait, tend to stand in front of a certain window with the crown right next to him, right? But so is the prime minister, instead of in front of the same window, with the same kind of imagery behind him. So this is kind of alluding to the idea that this is the person really in power. This is the big decision maker. And this exists right down to today. The prime minister of what is today the United Kingdom of Great Britain and part of Ireland, they're the ones who really run the country. The English monarchy, or today the UK monarchy, I guess you'd call it, they have the throne, they have the crown jewels, and they have their palaces, and they have nice parties and stuff, but they don't really do much. They don't decide on war or peace or negotiate. When the English House of Commons changed leadership and they got a new prime minister, I think in 2009 or 2010. Did you guys see that on TV when the line of horse-drawn carriages that are all laden with gold and jewels and stuff, they all pulled up to the House of Commons, and the first one just had the crown in it. They just brought her hat on and pillow. But that's how wealthy that monarchy is, and they show it off. But the monarchy's duties today are basically to show up on the first day that Parliament sits in session, get up at the podium and say, I give permission for this Parliament to rule the country. See you later. That's it. It's a longer speech than that, but that's the gist of it. Okay, so questions about that at all? No. All right. For the colonies, though, this whole restoration movement and eventually the new revolution, the Glorious Revolution, pushes political development in the colonies a lot of ways because it allows them to govern themselves. There are bigger things happening in London, and the Parliament in London doesn't really want to keep a close watch over the colonies. Allows them to run themselves because they're running fairly well. They're profitable. They're growing. They seem to be doing things well. And as the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. So by the early 1700s, the English government is being run by Parliament. by the Prime Minister largely. And England has built up this series of colonies along what eventually becomes the eastern coastline of the United States when we get to that point. And all those colonies start resembling each other in a lot of different ways. Number one, all their economies are based in agriculture one way or another, with the existence of slavery or not, because again, this is an ancient kind of civilization. This is an ancient economy before industrialization hits. The source of wealth is mostly located in land. There are a lot of merchants traveling around, buying and selling, making money for themselves that way. But basically, worldwide economies are still based largely in agriculture and farming. Raising food, selling it. Or raising crops, tobacco or cotton even eventually, selling them for profit. And of course, in the southern colonies, they are largely built on the backs of slave labor. Not so much in the north. So you start getting social differences going forward. Really, each of the major colonies has a large city that is its export center, which means that's where the boats arrive, they get loaded up and unload, and that's where they trade with the rest of the world. That's their contact point. So the northern colonies largely had Boston. New York had New York, surprise, surprise. Pennsylvania, which had some of the best farmland in all of the colonies, the most fertile land, so they grow huge amounts of crops. Philadelphia grows as their main export point and grows astronomically in the first few decades of the 1700s. And Charleston, literally Charlestown in the Carolinas, become the major export city there. And each of the colonies by the early 1700s has evolved or created some kind of representative, democratic kind of politics. It started with the House of Burgesses in Virginia, in Jamestown. Later, the Mayflower Compact had a big influence in the North. But each of these colonies creates a kind of representative politics where the colonists vote for their own colonial legislatures, their lawmaking bodies. When these are royal colonies, they often have like a military guy be the royal governor of the colony. So you get almost like a combined monarchy, just like exists in England at the time. You have a king on the throne, but Parliament passing all the laws. The same thing is largely true in the colonies. The elected legislature largely passes the laws, and the king's appointees govern and enforce the laws. And because those colonies have their own representative politics, they're passing their own laws, and they're doing a pretty good job of it. And also because England is largely distracted in a lot of worldwide, kind of European-wide at least, warfare in much of the first half of the 1700s. The English Parliament allows the colonies to govern themselves. And historians call this salutary neglect, which means you neglect to really micromanage them, watch over their shoulder, and direct them on a day-to-day basis. You allow them to make their own decisions for the most part. And that becomes a big problem when the English feel that they are the big winners of their international warfare by 1763. And in 1763, they go back to these colonies and will start saying, we're going to run you again. We're going to pass tax laws for you. And that engenders a lot of outrage amongst the colonists because by this point, by the 1760s, they've had at least 50 years of running themselves. Generations have gone by since the English have really tried to manage the colonies on a day-to-day basis. So that's going to engender a complaint and eventually revolution. I think there's another one. Oh, yeah. And they have grown territorially. And they have largely decimated, wiped out a lot of the indigenous tribes of their area, the East Coast, the Atlantic coast, to put it that way. And this was mostly done through disease. A lot of warfare also. And a lot of the native tribes, when they could not resist, they packed up and moved west, went over the Appalachians and into the kind of flatlands to the west of the Appalachians. And we can, again, see this statistically. From early English colonization, these four tribes, their populations collapsed. And again, through warfare, invasion, and disease, and being bought out and pushed around by groups that had heavier firepower and seemingly unending reinforcements coming from Europe, because a lot of money is being made in these areas. And again, economics is pushing political development. And by the time you get to, say, 1763, this is what the English colonies look like. And again, you have some wide social differences between the so-called, especially northern colonies, the New England colonies, and the southern colonies. The middle colonies are literally in the middle, so there's even a kind of buffer area between the two.